Hello and welcome to the final installment for our winter quarter of the Perloff lecture series, where the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies and Department of Urban Planning are celebrating 100 years of transportation research at UCLA. As always, we start by acknowledging the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land takers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands, where we are gathered today. We also acknowledge that funding for this series is provided by the Harvey S. Perloff Endowment. Harvey S. Perloff was the founding dean of the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UCLA, which brought more of a social sciences focus to both fields than other programs at the time when it started. And we are the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, the current iteration of transportation research at UCLA. We've learned by going into the university's archives and finding all of the papers associated with our institute or its predecessors that the first university transportation research center that is documented was established in the United States. Was established at UCLA in 1925. The initial focus was on street traffic, particularly in downtown Los Angeles, almost exclusively in downtown Los Angeles and other downtowns. The post-World War II period, it expanded to include traffic safety, environmental issues, and transportation engineering. And in the 1970s, particularly with Professor Martin Wax coming to UCLA, the focus shifted to social and behavioral aspects of travel. In the 90s, Professor Wax established a new research center for policy and planning at UCLA called the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. In the mid-2010s, it became part of a multidisciplinary, multi-campus, statewide research consortium known as UCITS. So we are celebrating all of this history this year. We are also acknowledging the passing of one of the center's directors over the years, Professor Donald Shoup, and we are raising money for a UCLA Center for Parking Policy in order to endow that center. And we plan to name that endowment after Professor Shoup when we are able to. And so today's talk on improving LA's transportation policy outcomes is with Joshua Schank, who is a senior fellow at UCLA ITS. And if you're wondering what that gig is, it's kind of a side gig. It's like there are other things that people do, and then we acknowledge their the things that they do for UCLA ITS through a senior fellowship. So in addition to being a senior fellow, Joshua Schank is a partner at InfraStrategies LLC, where he leads a practice focused on innovation, strategic planning, and technology. He is a research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute. And then prior to that, he worked as Metro's first chief innovation officer and was, prior to that, president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, which is a big DC federal policy think tank on transportation. And then the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he was the director of transportation research and got into the weeds of transportation budgeting because he had already been doing that as a transportation advisor to Senator Hillary Clinton of New York. He's the co-author of All Roads Lead to Congress, the $300 billion fight over highway funding. And he's somewhat knowledgeable about many things, and he's going to bestow us with some of that knowledge, but I think mainly perspective from experience combined with that knowledge today. So thank you. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Schank. Switch you over.
All right, thanks, Juan. And I do appreciate that a senior fellow at ITS does not come with a tremendous number of privileges, but I think one of the benefits is that I get to talk about my book today and tell you about how exciting it was to develop. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. Good. All right, thank you. Talk about how much fun it was to not only write this book, but to live the experience that you're going to hear about that's in this book. The book is essentially about the time that I spent as Chief Innovation Officer at LA Metro. I wrote it with Marla Westervelt Berg and Emma Huang, who are also in the Office of Extraordinary Innovation at Metro. And what it really is a series of stories about that experience and the lessons that we learned from it. I think the key thesis of the book is that um, implementation of new ideas is very hard. And everyone has great ideas. People at UCLA have great ideas. I spent a lot of time here listening to people who have great ideas. And I spent a lot of my career before I got to LA Metro thinking about what are the ideas, what are the things we should be doing, what's the right thing to do to improve transportation outcomes. That's very different than trying to actually do those things, as some of you know. Actually doing those things takes a lot of work, takes a very different set of skills than researching and analyzing those things. And that's a lot of what this book is about is what are the skills, what are the things that you need to learn how to do if you want to make real change in public policy and particularly in transportation. And that's what we're going to get at here. Okay, so I can use this. It's necessary, but no. Okay. So as I mentioned, I wrote this with Emma and Marla, both folks who are veterans of the Office of Extraordinary Innovation and who played a critical role in developing this book. And also, Emma still works with me at InfraStrategies, and we've continued doing a lot of the work that we did for Metro now for other transit agencies around the country. So very much still in the implementation phase of a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about. And what's funny is we're learning new lessons about what it's like to work with transit agencies around the country, as is Marla in her job at CityFi. And as a consultant, from that perspective, we see some of the very same issues and challenges, and we're actually able to help a lot of these agencies move forward. So I just also want to acknowledge that Mineta Transportation Institute, Juan mentioned I'm a research associate there. One of the benefits of that is that they help support this book and help us find a publisher, which is Business Expert Press. And I also want to make sure that you know that you can buy it, and it is on Amazon. It is available as of March 27th, but you can pre-order it now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Office of Extraordinary Innovation was. Crazy name, right? This graphic is a great illustration of what Office of Extraordinary Innovation is about, because we came to LA Metro, and one of the first things that happened is we sat down with the communications folks, and they helped us design this graphic. And then the next thing that happened was when we displayed this graphic to some of the folks who work for some of our board members, the response was, "You're not allowed to do that. We all have to have the same materials. We can't have different logos and for different departments. We decided that policy long ago." And that's a very typical reaction to how things were going and how things were received when OEI was created. Because OEI was created by Phil Washington, the CEO at LA Metro, because he wanted to shake things up and create a different attitude about change, which was that change was at the forefront of what he wanted to do. And that's why he called the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, a name that catches people's eye and certainly their ear and makes them think, oh, something big is happening here. Something really exciting is happening. This is not just somebody saying, oh, I'm going to do things differently. He really means it. And that's true. However, as that story I just told about the graphic illustrates, there is resistance whenever you try to do something new at a public agency, because there are policies in place and there are things that they've decided before you got there, and they may not always be well received. So the way this talk is organized is I'm going to talk about the strategies that we developed over time to overcome resistance. And these were hard learned. I did not know these walking in. I'm sure that some of you probably knew them better than I did if you've worked in public agencies. But I had worked, the last time I'd worked in a public agency before I took this job was as a peon right out of grad school at MTA in New York. And I hadn't really been exposed to what it was like to try to make change, because that wasn't exactly my job. And these are the strategies that we figured out over time. And some of them we were able to implement, and others we were too late. But these are: pick your battles and win them, make friends and collaborate, build processes, not projects, not just projects, navigate fiefdoms wisely, find willing collaborators, pace yourself because you need urgency and endurance, do the work up front, balance naivete with pragmatism, and recognize policy windows. And the book is essentially organized around some of these lessons, but these are the strategies that we outline in there. And I'm going to go through each of them and talk about how we learned those strategies and a little more about how to employ them. So when I first got to LA Metro, I went and met with each of the executives, and some of the other executives had a warm reception for me. Others did not. One of the other executives on the team greeted me with the following sentence: "Why are you even here?" And the reason that she asked that is that from her perspective, I didn't add any particular value by coming in from the outside and saying I had all kinds of great ideas and I was going to make change, because from her perspective, that wasn't necessary. She felt like she had everything she needed under control, and I was probably just going to annoy her. And in fact, later she did brand our office the office of extreme irritation, which she thought was very funny, because that's exactly what we were, right? We were coming and often trying to make change to things that she probably didn't want us meddling with, and many people didn't want us meddling with. But this picture is of my son, Max, who's now about to go to college, looking out from Burbank Peak, which is one of my favorite hikes in Los Angeles. And I used to go to Burbank Peak. I still do occasionally. It's a tough hike up, but it's worth it. I used to go there and look out at the city and think, what kind of change are we going to make here? What is this? What can we do about this sprawling metropolis and the transportation in it? Because I had a strong desire to make that change. And this, we have to understand the context in which this was happening. This is 2015, right? 2015, we've got, first of all, the traffic was building up as a real challenge in LA year over year in a way that it's not quite the same now, even though it's still pretty bad. We were seeing it spiral out of control more and more. We have a situation where a relatively new mayor was in there and had installed a new CEO at LA Metro. And we had a situation where Uber and Lyft were just getting on the scene and potentially causing a lot of the traffic that was happening. And they were seen as a real threat to public transit, and technology as a whole being developed in smartphone apps was seen as something that was either a threat or an opportunity for public transit. So in this context, it made a lot of sense for an innovation office to be thinking about, how do we work with the private sector? How do we develop these ideas together so that it's not purely a competition? And that is, in fact, why Phil Washington created the office. He gave us two specific roles. One, to do strategic planning for the agency, develop the agency's strategic plan. And two, to work with the private sector to develop new ideas, including public-private partnerships for major capital projects, but also including technology. And as part of that role, act as a liaison to the academic community to bring in new ideas that we could build and develop. So that's the context in which this was happening. I think it's also important, before we get into the meat of this, to think about what LA's governance structure looks like. And I know a lot of people in this room probably already know, but the governance structure of LA is unusual and complex. One of the things I always like to ask people is to quiz you, and Jody's excluded from this quiz, but like, do you know what's a city? Is my favorite game to play in Los Angeles, right? So, for example, who knows? Culver City, is that a city? No, not you. You know. Yes, Culver City's a city. Is Venice a city? No. Studio City, is that a city? No, not a city, right? These are the things that you find out when you work in transportation in Los Angeles for a long time, but I had no idea about, obviously, coming in. Now, there are 88 cities in LA County, right? And there are 10 to 11 million people, depending on when you took the census in LA County, making it bigger than about 40 states, which means that LA Metro was governing this enormous budget, which is now over $9 billion, in essentially what was one of the largest states in the country with 88 cities in it. And unusually as well, LA Metro is not your typical transit agency. They are a multimodal transportation planning, building, operating agency, which makes that context even more different, because that's like a state DOT, except even more powerful. Most state DOTs don't operate a mass transit system carrying over 1 million people a day. And most state DOTs don't have access to the amount of local funding that through sales tax measures that LA Metro does. So LA Metro is not just a metro. And many people might think of it as a transit agency, but it is so much more than that and plays such a bigger role in people's lives than we're even aware of. So that was the context in which we were joining. And then the other thing I alluded to earlier that was really interesting about how the political system works. So, I think most of you probably know that LA Metro has 13 board members, and those board members have various places they come from. Some come from the city of Los Angeles, some come from the COGS appointing them, and then the county supervisors are on there. But what you may not know, and what is also unusual about LA Metro, is that each of those board members have staff who work for them, who are assigned to transportation or to LA Metro. Those are board staff. Board staff play an unusual role at LA Metro. They have what's called board staff briefings every month before the board meeting. And the board staff briefing is an unusual artifact of the fact that is a very strange arrangement, which is that the Brown Act prohibits the board from getting together and talking about stuff in private, right? And therefore, before things come to the board, it is helpful, in theory, to have the staff vet what's going on, because they can all meet together and talk as if they are board members and reflect back what their board members might say about the things you're bringing to the board before you bring to the board. Now, this in theory would be a very useful exercise that people would enjoy, because now you're vetting what's happening before you get to the board. And now you have a better chance of getting your items passed, right? Because you're working with staff beforehand. That's somewhat true. But what I didn't understand is that board staff serve as somewhat gatekeepers to a lot of what's happening here. And whether they have a strong role or not, they believe they have an outsized role in influencing policy. And they believe in that room that they are the board members, and they will sit and act as if they are the board members, while CEOs and other executives who've been working in transportation for 30 or 40 years and have tremendous amounts of expertise come up and essentially beg with them to allow them to move their item forward in the way that they would like to move it forward. And then they can lob criticism and tell them why they are lazy bureaucrats who haven't really done enough work, and tell them why they need to redo it all, because otherwise their board member's not going to like it. And it's an interesting dynamic because it's so different. I worked in Congress, and I worked with, I was on congressional staff and Senate staff, and we never would have had an opportunity to sit in a room and act as if we were the congressional people that we were working for, the senators we were working for. We, of course, got together and talked about legislative initiatives, but it was not in a setting where we were dealing with the actual CEOs of the agencies that we were working with. That's what's so unusual about this, is that Phil Washington had to sit there for 4 hours while the board staff told him what they thought of his potential ideas. So that setup created some antagonism and challenges that also made it difficult for us to move forward. But that's just another example of some of the things we're up against. And it leads me into our first lesson, which is pick your battles and win them. And I have to give full credit to a friend of mine, one of my best friends in life, who came up with this idea about his children rather than about LA Metro. But it certainly applies, and it applies to any big agency. For example, when I was in Washington, D.C., I used to work with some former secretaries of transportation. They were part of the Eno board, and I would ask them, what should you do? What's the advice you give to a new secretary when they come in? Because they always talk to the new secretaries, and they'd say, well, pick 2 or 3 things you're going to do and just do those. Because if you try to do everything, you're going to fail. And you'll be lucky to get to do those 3 things, and you got to focus on those. And I think the pick your battles and win them part is really critical here, because you can pick your battles but you have to be careful you're picking ones that you're going to win, because if you pick one that you're going to lose, then people see that you can fail and they're going to jump all over that. I think one of the best examples of this is actually the current CEO of LA Metro, who was put in charge of getting the Express Lanes program done and faced a number of obstacles to doing that. And in order to get the Express Lanes program done, had to fight against lots of different people internally and externally. But when she succeeded, well, success has 1,000 fathers, right? So she was all of a sudden, everyone was behind her once she got that done. Same thing is true for us. We had to pick our battles and win them. And I'm going to talk about just a couple of battles that we picked. One being with Uber Pool and one being with bike share. So Uber Pool was an example of trying to do business with Uber and allowing Uber Pool to bring people to and from the new stations on the Culver City Metro. On the Expo line, when it was extended from Culver City to Santa Monica, when that opened, we worked with Uber Pool to develop a partnership whereby they would bring people to and from those stations for a discounted rate. There was tremendous resistance to this idea within LA Metro. And the reason there was tremendous resistance is that we were trying to work with a competitor that they perceived as a competitor, because we were trying to do something that was messing up a launch of a new line. That certainly people were nervous about that this was going to confuse people. And third, that we also faced the resistance with Uber itself, because Uber was not really conducive to working with public transit, was not used to doing that either. And so in order to get Uber Expo done, we faced obstacles such as, you may know that Santa Monica prohibits advertising at stations that are in the city of Santa Monica. So we were not able to advertise this despite the fact that it was in existence there. But also we had to figure out how to advertise in the city of LA, and no one in LA Metro would help us. So we literally had to drive around and put up signs that were advertising this event. Another thing I want to talk about is what you see on the right, which is bike share. And you can see that one of my favorite people, Avital Shavit, is in that picture. And she was the leader of the bike share program. She was one of the people who got it established. And she eventually did join the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. But before she did that, we had an unsolicited proposal that came in from a group that was offering to do bike share for free with dockless bikes. And when that proposal came in for us to do dockless bikes, we thought, like, well, why wouldn't we do something that is new and exciting that allows us to bring the bike share to more people? And we said, okay, Avital, why wouldn't we bring in this new bike share program? And she said, well, here's 10 reasons why you shouldn't do it. And one of them was, that this company was probably going to go out of business. She was right about that. Another was that we already had a deal that we were going to work on getting bike share in Venice, and this would conflict with that. She was right about that. And we eventually went down the list and abandoned this effort and realized that this was not going to be worth our time or worth our effort. And so those two different ideas and proposals, I think, are a good example of when we had to pick a battle and when we didn't. And we're really glad we didn't pick the battle on bike share, because yes, that company did go out of business within, I think, a month or so. But also, I was really glad we picked the battle with Uber Pool, because the fact that we were able to get Uber Pool done meant that we were able to then do more work with rideshare companies in the future. And that was something that we needed to be able to do to be successful. The quote on here that was really interesting and useful, and which relates to pick your battles and win them, is, you don't have 2 years. That is what the chair of the board told me. That's what the chair of the board told me when I first met with him. And what he meant by that is, this is great that you're doing this whole innovation thing, but we want to see some results. Well, Uber Pool was the first result, and it showed that we could do it, and it bought us some time and bought us some leverage within the organization. All right, make friends and collaborate. Well, this quote was interesting. One of the first things that we heard, when this is from the Chief Innovation Officer, when we brought him an idea, in this case, it was an idea for using drones, his reaction was, Bob says it's a bad idea. Well, we didn't know who Bob was. We didn't understand what this even meant, but that was the end of the conversation. And the point of that is that in many cases, what you think you have a good idea of a new technology what you'll actually find is that the new technology does not necessarily comport with what the agency is already doing, and they may not be all that thrilled about adopting it. And I'm going to tell a couple of stories that relate to that. But the key thing to remember here is that when you're thinking about new technologies, if there's no process by which you're going to be able to get that technology through, then you're going to have to build that process itself. And I'll come back to that theme later. But the key is that if you want to get that technology through, you're going to need allies. You're going to need people to work with you on it, because otherwise it's going to be very challenging. So the first story is about the Orange Line. So if you're, this is now the G Line. If you've ever been on the Orange Line, you may notice that it sometimes stops at red lights. It is not intending to stop at those red lights. What's supposed to happen is you're supposed to be able to drive at a certain speed and hit every green light along the Orange Line busway, right? But we thought, based on what we heard from a smart fellow in operations who submitted this idea to us, that if we could just tell the drivers what speed they should go, then they would be able to hit every green light. And so we would put an iPad on the dashboard, they'd be able to go through and do that and hit every green light along. So we tested it, we put it out there, we saw what happened, and guess what happened? It still managed to hit red lights. Why is that? Because the red lights are operated by City of Los Angeles, not LA Metro. And so the City of Los Angeles had told LA Metro that they were timed, but they actually were not timed. So when you have a situation like that, you're now facing a much bigger obstacle, which is you have to work with the City of Los Angeles, which, as everyone knows, is probably not your favorite thing to do. But, right. But if you're working with the City of Los Angeles over time to actually do this, now you're talking about a major investment of time. You have to build a tremendous amount of capital in order to get this through. And we had to abandon that effort because otherwise it would have been too much of our time trying to just get this very simple thing that we thought was easy to do. The second example of what it's like to actually make friends and collaborate is that we had to figure out how we're going to get bus lanes enforced, right? We had an idea, an unsolicited proposal that came in that said, okay, why don't we take pictures of people in bus lanes that are violating the law, and we can ticket them. Now, there was one major problem with this idea, which you may be aware of, which is that at the time it was illegal to do that. So there was a state law on the books that says that you're not able to ticket to issue a violation to a bus that's to a vehicle that's in a bus lane, and there was an exemption that San Francisco had at the time, but LA did not have an exemption. So what does that mean? That means that in order to get this idea through, which we thought was a really important idea, right? Because buses that are blocked by parked vehicles, we actually went out and sampled it. There were a lot of buses being blocked by parked vehicles, typically by wealthy individuals who were pulling over to get Starbucks. There's 30 people in a bus or 50 people in a bus who are trying to get to work and they're being blocked. That seems like a tremendous equity issue, a tremendous challenge that we could solve with this very simple technology. So what did that mean? How did we have to go about that? Well, we had to build a coalition to change the law, get the RFP out, and actually implement it. That process from start to finish took about 6 years and actually was not implemented until after we left LA Metro. But it did happen. And it happened because of one particular individual, Nolan Borgman, who spent a tremendous amount of time making those friends, building those coalitions, working with the government affairs, whose first reaction to this when we came and said, well, could we change the law, was, well, I'm not changing the law unless a board member tells me to change the law. So that was a great indication that we were going to have to do a lot of work to bring even him around internally. And in order to do that, we also had to bring the LADOT again around, because LADOT was going to be issuing the citations and they were going to want the revenue from those citations. So if we went around them, they would probably not be too thrilled with us. They might let the mayor know about that. So we had to figure our way around that. So the point here is that when the chief operations officer said it's a bad idea, or Bob says it's a bad idea, what that means is you haven't done the work yet to build the relationships you need to get these new ideas through. And that's Well, that's something that's tough. And then remember, we're in an environment where we were told we did not have 2 years to get this done. So we didn't have a lot of time to make friends and collaborate, or so we thought. But the truth is that if you skip this step, and if you go right to, well, this is a good idea, and why should we do it? You're going to hit a brick wall every time. If you start with, okay, what are the relationships I need to build in order to get things through? You're likely to be a lot more successful. All right, build processes, not just projects. So this quote, I have to be honest, is not from anyone at LA Metro. This quote is from someone at a different agency that I've worked with since LA Metro. When we put into one of their strategic plans the idea that perhaps we should solicit ideas from the private sector, because the private sector could potentially provide good ideas, this was the response. And unfortunately, that is not atypical. There are many transit agencies and people at public agencies who feel this way. They feel they know their business. The private sector does not know their business. But what we discovered is that if you can build a process through which you can introduce new ideas, you're much more likely to get those ideas through. A lot of the problem is that people think that the problems that exist, the challenges you're facing in a public agency, are technology challenges. We run up against this all the time. And they think, well, if we just upgrade the technology, it'll be better. But usually technology challenges are masking process challenges. And what's actually going on is that they don't have a process by which they can bring in new ideas. They don't have a process by which they can try new things. And so sometimes you have to build that process. A great example is this mobile cubes idea, which you may have seen at some point at LA Metro stations. They were at a few of them. They are no longer there. And there's a reason why they're no longer there. One is that people kept literally beating them up and throwing them on the floor. Another reason is that they didn't really work out the way that we'd hoped. Mobile cubes came to us with the idea that if we put these in the stations, it would be no cost to us. People could charge their phones. It would be a win-win, right? It'd be a passenger amenity. Costs us nothing, right? So simple. Just put this in the station, right? Should be easy. Well, why is that not easy? Because there are at least 5 or 6 different departments at LA Metro that are in charge of what goes into stations and what doesn't, and have something to say about it. Not to mention many labor unions that have something to say about it. Not to mention that it is actually not okay for us to accept a gift of the machine in the station. We had to structure it as a lease agreement in order to be allowed to do it. They can't just put it in our station. Otherwise, we would have to do an RFP process to say who could put the thing in our station that would work the best to accomplish what we wanted to do. So we had to lease it to them. So we're talking about real estate, we're talking about stations, we're talking about operations, we're talking about security. All these folks had to be involved in this process of trying to bring this one simple machine into our stations as a passenger amenity. So naturally, it took 2 years for us to figure out even to get these in. And what we learned at the end of those 2 years, we put these in, didn't work out so well, fine. That wasn't the point. The point is, perhaps we should have a way of testing new ideas in stations that is already built in. And we actually did create that. So before we left, we created a process by which we could have a test kitchen for new ideas in stations. And you're actually seeing now, LA Metro has put a lot more new ideas and new innovations into stations. I don't know if it's because of that process, but what I do know is that you have to build that process in order to get those ideas through. If the process doesn't exist, then you're not going to be able to have new ideas get through. Similar on Sepulveda, right? Sepulveda Transit Corridor, you may know that recently the selection was made about which company to go with. Thank you, Jody. Now, the thing about this process was we helped create this process, which was a PDA, a pre-development agreement for the transit corridor, by which 2 different firms would be competing for the right to build this project, the Sepulveda Transit Corridor, and that those 2 firms, which, as you know, wound up with very different ideas, right? One was a heavy rail essentially underneath the mountain. Another was a monorail on the 405. And we set up that process because of a couple of reasons. One, because we thought that a public-private partnership would be a potential way to reduce costs and mitigate the risks of this project, right? The way that a public-private partnership can mitigate risk is that you're able to have private companies manage the risk that they're more effective at managing. and the public sector can manage the risk that it's more effective at managing. The reality is that the public sector is really bad at managing risks that have to do with with things that where politics gets in the way, right? And so what we saw was that it was going to be very expensive to do this project, no matter what, right? You're talking about getting a train from a valley to the west side, from the valley to the west side through a mountain range. No matter what, it was going to be expensive. So we could at least shave some of the cost off and have this thing have a chance of being built if we structured it as a public-private partnership and allowed the private sector to manage some of that risk more effectively. And so we wanted to create this PDA process, but there was no process for a PDA at LA Metro. And again, this was not a new idea. The idea of a PDA for this corridor has been around for 15, 20 years. We weren't taking a new idea. What we were doing was building the process by which that new idea could become a reality, which meant going to each department, working with each department, and developing a set of goals and risks and analyzing those goals and risks with each department until we could build consensus around the idea that this was a structure that was worth doing. And it took us several years before we could even move forward on this. You know, Phil, when we first came in, said, well, you know, when I was in Denver, we got an unsolicited proposal. We turned it around in 6 weeks and started construction, you know, very soon thereafter. And I thought, that sounds fast, but okay, let's see if we can do that. The reality was that whatever reasons that might have worked in Denver could not work in LA. And we had to spend the time and put in the effort of building this process for a PDA in order to be successful. And then we did. And we received the bids on the PDA. It went forward. We've come to where we are now today as a result of that. But I think the lesson here is that if you're going to try to do something radically different and totally new for an agency, again, you've got to spend the time developing that process and not just plow ahead. Okay, navigate fiefdoms wisely. The quote here, wait, did that just really happen, is from a meeting that we had with the folks who run TAP, which is the card that we use to access the metro stations, wherein we had several ideas that we'd been hearing from the private sector about things we could do to improve TAP, make it more user-friendly, make it easier, get to open payment, that sort of thing. And they were so upset with us for bringing these ideas to them that they walked out of the room. And we turned to ourselves and said, wait, did that really just happen? Now, why was that happening? Well, TAP, which, as you may know, is part of the finance department at LA Metro, is really its own entity because it has all these other constituencies of transit agencies that it serves beyond LA Metro. It is not just an LA Metro office. And the CFO, who was leading that office and leading that department, was very uninterested in our ideas and very protective of the fiefdom that she had created. And we came up against that over and over again because when we first got there, this is 2015, right? People were starting to get used to the idea that your smartphone would be a way to pay for transit fares. And we're like, oh, great. What's the plan for getting TAP to be able to use, TAP on your phone? And we got silence in response. Oh, well, we should be working towards open payment. So, which many transit agencies now have, and LA Metro still does not. What's the plan? Like, what's our strategic plan? How are we getting there? Silence, no response. And when that happens, you can do one of two things. You can say, I'm going to fight harder and try to fix this and battle, or you can walk away. Unfortunately, we chose the former. And we spent many years and much wasted time trying to deal with the Transit Access Pass, trying to improve the TAP, and getting absolutely nowhere. And so what we take away from that is sometimes there's going to be an impenetrable fiefdom, and you just have to recognize it and walk away. Goes back to pick your battles and win them, because you're unlikely to be successful. In this case, the reason that this fiefdom was going to be impenetrable is that this particular person had been there a long time. She had very strong relationships with board members. She had a very secure position, and she knew where all the bodies were buried. So messing with her was not going to get us anywhere. Now, another example of fiefdoms coming back to LADOT again, which I'm not intending to bring them up every minute, but they are another key factor here. When the Expo line extension opened, and we all got on there as executives and rode the entire line out to Santa Monica for the grand opening, I noticed something which, to my northeastern New York eyes, was very disturbing, which is that it took an hour to do that. And I thought, that seems like a really long time to go this distance. And I know that traffic is bad, but I mean, are people really going to use the Expo line when it takes an hour to get downtown? So I thought, okay, we're the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. What can we do about this? So I arranged a meeting with Salita Reynolds, who was now the current Chief Innovation Officer at LA Metro. I arranged a meeting with her at LADOT when she was running LADOT, and I came in and I said, what can we do to get these trains to move faster? Because they're stopping at red lights, and it's causing a real slowdown. The city of Santa Monica, by the way, had preemption in place, so the trains were not stopping at red lights there, so we didn't have to worry about it. But they were stopping in LA, and it was severely slowing the runtime. So Salita was very open to this idea, and I think really wanted to help us. But unfortunately, she was facing some internal fiefdoms of her own. So if you're not familiar with ATSAC, that's a great acronym to learn about. There are a bunch of folks in a basement at LADOT who designed the original traffic signal system for the 1984 Olympics, many of whom are literally the same people who designed the system, who are still there or were still there in 2016, and who were very resistant to anything that might affect their beautiful system that works so well to keep traffic flowing in Los Angeles, as we know. So any attempt that Salita might have made, and she was picking her battles and winning them, to try to mess with them and try to mess with their signal system was not worth it to her, because she's Metro. She was not Metro at the time. And so putting in that time of an effort did not seem like the greatest use of her time. And we got nowhere. So again, recognizing where there might be some places that you're going to hit a brick wall, really important. And then the final one I want to talk about is the West Santa Ana branch, which was a corridor that is now known as the Southeast Gateway Line. And there we were also looking at using a public-private partnership to move forward. And what we found when we tried to move forward with a public-private partnership is that the planning department at LA Metro had zero interest in using a public-private partnership for this program. But we could not possibly move forward with this without the planning department involved. And what happened was that they would keep stalling us and not providing information and making it very difficult for this to move forward, to the point where eventually this project was determined that it could not be a P3. It took 5 years of them stalling and 5 years of us fighting for that to happen. Now, in retrospect, there wasn't much we could do because we were designated by the CEO as the P3 office. The mayor wanted us to look at P3s. We had to push this forward. This was something we really wanted. We did not have a willing collaborator, and we needed that willing collaborator. And that's why we were not successful. But again, when you see impenetrable fiefdoms and you can't collaborate and make friends, that's probably a battle that you don't want to pick. Instead, what you should be doing is finding willing collaborators. I mentioned earlier that developing rideshare partnerships was a critical component of what we did. We eventually developed 2 rideshare partnerships, one with First Last Mile with VIA at several stations, and then the Metro Micro program, which still exists today. Now, in order to do that, sometimes you have to figure out who the right collaborator is. When we began our effort to create this First Last Mile program at several Metro stations under the Mobility on Demand grant from the Federal Transit Administration, we were working with Lyft. And Lyft had submitted the grant application with us and was clearly wanting to be our partner, or so we thought. But then 1 or 2 years into this effort of working with them, it became more and more clear that they were not going to be willing to share data with us that would allow us to actually do this partnership. And we had to figure out what we were going to do next. And fortunately, we had this advisory board that we created that came to us and said, look, you have to do something different. You can't work with Lyft. And that's where this quote comes from, because we had to go to Lyft. And even though it's from Seinfeld, I still used this quote and say, it's not you, it's me. We got to break up. We got to find a new partner on this. And that's what we did. And we found VIA, and Emma Huang, who was one of the authors of this book, helped put together this partnership with VIA that still exists today, and eventually became rolled into the what is now the Metro Micro program. And the VIA system that we created would not have been possible if we had just tried to stick with the same original collaborator that we had. We had to move forward. We had to try somebody different. And we had to create an entirely new process here as well, because we couldn't do a new procurement. There was no way to do a procurement. But FTA relaxed their regulations, and we were able to do something a little more innovative and bring VIA in. And speaking of Metro Micro is an example of this lesson, which is how you need both urgency and endurance to get things done. There is, at the time that we were developing microtransit here in Los Angeles, in the Metro Micro program, which now exists, there was no similar program like this. Kansas City had done an experiment, a couple other places, but nothing really on this scale. And we were trying to do this microtransit program at one of the largest transit agencies in the country. So you can imagine that there was a lot of conflict, a lot of challenges, like labor unions weren't thrilled about it, right? We had to develop a relationship with the union in order to build support for this initiative, which we did with the operating union. There were people throughout the agency who would say things like, why would we partner with a competitor? Why would we do this? And so in order to get this done, there were two things that had to happen simultaneously. One is you had to race towards these particular mini goals of trying to get through, right? We had to get the idea that this was something we were going to do and get buy-in from operations. Now we got to get to the RFP process. Now we got to select the person, the folks we're going to work with. Now we got to work with the union to figure out what that contract's going to look like. Each of those little spurts required tremendous urgency, but it took many, many years of endurance to actually get this through. So you have to recognize that if you're going to try to start something new, it's not going to happen quickly, but it is going to take a lot of different sprints throughout that process to get things done urgently, along with a long-term effort that requires tremendous amount of endurance. Doing the work up front. This quote actually comes from someone I currently work with, who once created a special consulting team within a large consulting firm that was focused on the kind of big picture, high-end, innovative stuff. I was actually part of that. That's how I know this guy. His quote about it was, people will either want to be in it or they will hate it. And he told Phil this when Phil said he was going to start the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. And it was extremely true. There was, as I mentioned earlier, the general disdain for our office from some departments. But there were also a lot of people within the agency who were like desperate to be a part of this. And that's why Phil wisely created a program called the OEI Fellowship that was going along with this a new office. People would apply. Every year we would take 2 new people to be a part of the office from within the agency. And those people would come and work in our department for a year and then go back to their relevant department. Here's the problem. They never wanted to go back. And they were getting the chance to work on big picture stuff and really exciting and interesting things. And the departments that lent them to us probably knew going in that they weren't coming back. And so that created some struggles as well. But that said, having these people in our office was a tremendous value for the office, because there were people who understood the agency, understood what was happening, and were able to advise us from a pragmatic standpoint of what we will do. And I'll get to more of that later. But the key is that if you're going to come in with new ideas, you have to be able to do the work up front to know how those ideas are going to play out and to understand more about them than anyone else. So many times, if we would walk into a room and say, oh, here's this new thing we want to talk about, other people would start talking about something else that was their expertise because they were trying to shut it down. So you had to know more about what they were going to talk about than they did if you're going to be successful, because people will often use their tremendous expertise and knowledge about specific things to tell you why your new idea is not going to work. So you absolutely have to be ready for that. Another thing that we did upfront that helped, besides the fellowship, was create, as I mentioned earlier, this OEI advisory board, which included many people from UCLA on it. And that OEI advisory board was also critical because they were people looking outside looking from the outside of what we were doing, able to advise us on what we should do and what we should do better. But also because we now had, we're giving people on the outside a tremendous amount of insight into what was happening in the organization, which they too appreciated. And that helped us create not only a place where we could go to for advice, but people who would support us in ideas as they came out. Okay, and so this next one is about the critical balance between naivete and pragmatism that I think anyone who's looking to make change needs to take into consideration. Naivete is a good thing. It really is, because if you don't have it and you come in and you want to try new things, you're going to talk yourself out of all, right? Oh, when I was interviewing people to be the number 2 in the department, I wound up hiring Nadine Lee, who's now the current CEO in Dallas. It was between her and one other person. And the other person was really smart and had a lot of great ideas, but told me why each of them would never happen. And she was naive enough to believe that they still could happen because she was coming from the outside. So you need people who are coming from the outside. But on the other hand, you also need people who are been around the block, who understand why things are not always so easy, and who can know how to work the system to get what you need. So I'll give a couple examples of that. One was the Metro Vision 2028 strategic plan, which represented a sea change, a major change about what Metro was about, and a focus that was very different than what it had been previously, moving the entire organization towards much more ambitious goals about how we were going to reduce the number of people in single occupancy vehicles. We couldn't get to that by writing a document like that and saying, here's our great ideas, let's all do that. We had to have a process internally to build support for that. And fortunately, we had brought over a fellow, Tam Nguyen, who had done that already as strategic planning for active transportation within the agency. So she knew what that process could look like and was able to put together a process that got this plan passed in 2018 unanimously by the board of directors. And one of the things in that plan is the second story, which is the traffic reduction study, because one of the things in that plan was this idea that we should look at congestion pricing for Los Angeles, which we were able to get into the plan because of the work that Tam did to try to build that support. But also, not long after the plan passed, an opportunity arose to get the board to endorse congestion pricing, which is a strange thing you wouldn't have thought would happen in Los Angeles. And that's where this quote comes from. That will never happen in Los Angeles, which was told to me by one of the executives at LA Metro when we tried putting congestion pricing in the strategic plan. And if you believe that that will never happen, you're right. Because as long as you believe that, it will never happen. You have to have the belief that real change can occur. And we were fortunate enough that the board was looking up ahead to the Olympics, which I think are coming up soon, right? And was thinking, well, we'd like to get a lot of these new projects that we just passed in Measure M built by the Olympics. So in order to do that, let's put together this list, the famous list that was then called 28 by 28, which the mayor of LA put together. And he came to LA Metro and said, here are the 28 projects we want to build by 2028. And we said, there's no way you can do that. And he said, well, can you just like say that some of these projects are aspirational? And we said, okay, we'll compromise and say some of them are aspirational. And then not long after that, the board came and said, well, so what's happening with these 28 by 28 projects that should be done by now? Because we said that they were going to be done. You know, we don't see the evidence of progress. And Phil very deftly managed to turn that threat into an opportunity by saying, okay, you want those projects? Let's figure out where we're going to get the money to get those projects. And he's put everyone, all the executives at Metro, coming up with ideas and ways that we could generate the money that the board wanted to get those projects done faster. And the best idea, of course, was congestion pricing. And so we came back to the board and said, we're going to do congestion pricing and we're going to have free fares, which is something else the board liked. And that's how you're going to get your projects. And they, of course, said, don't do that, but we will allow you to look at congestion pricing as a potential strategy. And they endorsed that project and moved it forward. And that project is still moving forward in theory today. I'm not on top of the latest, but I understand that LA Metro is still looking at it. It is obviously was beset by some challenges when the pandemic completely changed all of the traffic patterns. But nonetheless, something that was not considered possible is still now something that is being considered by LA Metro. And in order for that to happen, you have to have that balance of naivete and pragmatism. And finally, recognize policy windows. This quote is from somebody who I really like at LA Metro, but who nonetheless is a little bit cynical. And this is when we were about a year or two in, and we were building new offices for OEI, right? And we had been in some temporary place, and we were building this nice new innovation office where we could be. And he said, yeah, one day there'll be a new CEO with their own ideas, and I'll have to come back and redo all of this at Metro's expense. And of course, he's right. He was right, right? There's no more Office of Extraordinary Innovation. There's still an innovation office, but this was something that was going to be in a certain amount of time, and then it was going to be over. And he knew that he'd been a veteran long enough to see that. But the insight there is that you only have a certain amount of time to get your new ideas through, because things change. And whatever power or capital you might enjoy is temporary. And in fact, we didn't know when our window was going to close, but it did close, right? Phil was there and Phil was not there. And once Phil was not there, the window was closed. So you have to figure out when you're going to get things through and how you're going to time it in order to be effective. So just talk about a few things. One is my favorite project, the gondola from Dodger Stadium to Union Station, which still somehow limps along to this day. But this was a really interesting idea because it came from the private sector, and the private sector was offering to build the entire thing, and it was opportunity to get essentially free infrastructure and something that could be iconic. But you have to understand that when we had an unsolicited proposal process at the Office of Extraordinary Innovation where anyone could submit ideas, we were bombarded with lots of crazy ideas, right? Putting aside the gondola, which was the most reasonable of those ideas, we had, the monorail, which we talked about earlier, hyperloops, Hyperloop was proposed, PRT was a nice, fun one that often comes up. We even had a proposal for a rail in the sky that couldn't turn, and you had to turn the rail instead of the train. It was so people came up with all kinds of fantastical things, and you had to sort through which of those were realistic and which were not. And we chose the gondola and really pushed this through. And we had a window of time in which to get it through that we didn't necessarily recognize at the time was there, because the mayor was a big booster. And the mayor got hold of this and helped us get this done. The mayor's no longer there. The mayor left, project stalls. That's how these things go. But the point is that you have to see when that window of opportunity is and try to move forward. Another example is the pandemic. Pandemic created a crisis whereby we saw an opportunity to get things done and potentially move things forward. And Phil created a recovery task force. He had our office run the recovery task force. He said, okay, when the pandemic's over, here's all the things we're going to do to recover. Here are all the new ideas we're going to bring in. It was a window of opportunity that he saw to try to implement new ideas. Phil often loved to quote Rahm Emanuel, who was saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. I learned that Rahm Emanuel was actually quoting Winston Churchill. But nonetheless, this idea of never let a good crisis go to waste was a great one. Unfortunately, the way that the pandemic played out, because of the tremendous financial toll that it took on transit agencies, and because it played out for a long period of time, we wound up in a situation where instead of it being an opportunity, we would say, oh, why don't we try this new thing that could help? And they would say, I'm too scared to try anything new right now. I'm just trying to keep my head above water. I'm not going to invest any time in new ideas. And we hit against a wall on that. But also, interestingly, many of the ideas that we put in that Recovery Task Force report did actually come to fruition and have eventually happened. But the crisis itself was a policy window that we perceived to be an opportunity for change that wasn't necessarily as much of an opportunity that we thought. And then finally, I think the other key thing I wanted to mention is that it goes back to the idea of making friends, collaborating, building processes. A recovery task force is a great idea, but in order for a recovery task force to work, everyone has to agree on what you're actually trying to achieve, and that this is something that's good that you want to do, is to use this window of opportunity to create new ideas. Not everybody agreed on that. And that's one of the reasons that it failed. In fact, we had executives pulling the people that they from their departments off the recovery task force because the ideas we were proposing were too radical and they didn't want to be associated with them. So I want to leave you with some final thoughts before we move to any questions. And this is a book. So I'm not doing a book reading, but I do want to read you from some of the last paragraphs of the book because I think it's useful for us to think about, right? And first is, whether you're a CEO, a mid-level manager, or someone just a few years into public service, we hope that the stories in this book give you the tools and courage to move positive change forward. You don't need perfect timing, although it helps. And you definitely don't need permission. What you need is a sense of purpose, a willingness to try, and the resilience to keep going when it gets hard. And in fact, changing government is never easy, but it's always worth trying. And I hope that you can learn from what OEI did, our wins, stumbles, and strategies, so they'll help you go further than we did. You can make real progress from wherever you sit. Above all, never lose sight of why you are here. No one joins public service to get rich, but many stay because it's safe or familiar, or it gives them a sense of power. We hope that you're here because you believe that government can be a force for good, and that through hard work, you can help make people's lives better. I believe that too. And I hope this book helps you do that. And I hope this talk was informative about some of the ways that you too can be involved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. Are there any questions from our students about being a force for good, perhaps? About the challenges along the way? Are there any questions from anyone? Okay, I'll give it to Adam first, and then you can.
That's fine. Thanks, Joshua. This is really interesting. And my question is about, you focus a lot on like internal processes and coalitions and so on in Metro. But can you talk more about like the relationship with like the world outside Metro as well? So what does it mean for kind of external like NGOs, advocates, elected officials, like other people to support these projects? Or is it really like something that the Metro's internal processes have to figure out on their own?
Yeah, I mean, so the book focuses on the internal struggle for a very good reason, which is that in my experience in Washington, D.C., I was very used to the idea that politics was the main issue, right? And you're going to have to deal with the politics of a situation. And the way we dealt with that in D.C. was we tried to create bipartisan support behind everything we were going to do for federal policy change. We would create that bipartisan support. We would bring it to congressional staff. And we would say, look, these are good ideas that have support from both parties. Would you consider adopting them? And we often had success. But what's different about this environment is that what I found anyway, is that the biggest obstacles to success were not political, were not external. There was no partisan environment, first of all, right? You have one party rule. But even beyond that, the political obstacles were very knowable and very understandable. And you could say like, okay, elected officials probably aren't going to love congestion pricing. They probably would like the idea of trying to move people faster on the Orange Line, right? A lot of these ideas, you could pretty much know what the political response was going to do, or was going to be, and you could choose your strategies for trying to deal with that political response. But the internal turned out to be the much bigger barrier than we had anticipated. I think in our naivete that I highlighted, we came into the situation thinking, well, everybody at LA Metro wants to improve mobility and therefore would be on board with new ideas that improve mobility. And that naive, thought was dashed soon enough. And that's why we had to come up with these other strategies to deal with the fact that, in fact, at public agencies, not surprisingly, many people are focused on optimizing their narrow swath of the agency, not necessarily the big picture goal of mobility. We were among the very few people at the agency who were given the power and the ability think about those big picture issues and talk about how to solve them. So that's why it's such an internal focus, because compared to the external stuff, the internal was way harder.
So what's the role then for external parties, or does it really not matter whether it's whether it's advocacy or like research that like University Transportation Institutes might do, or even elected officials? Like, is there a space like or types of issues where they can be influential, or is it?
No, yeah, I don't mean to say that they aren't influential. I think they are. I think a lot of the ideas that come from academia or come from think tanks, look like they permeate and they become part of the conversation, and they can eventually become reality. But they take effort to get to that implementation process, part of the process. So it's not like ideas aren't useful, and it's not like research and analysis isn't useful. It's just necessary but not sufficient to move forward and get something actually done. That's all.
Hi there. Thank you. Oh, hi everyone. I'm Jody Litvak, another one of the senior fellows, and up until about 15 months ago, I was at LA Metro, and my last position was Executive Officer of Community Relations. And I did not know this was going to be your question, but what I would like to say is come back on May 6th when I will be speaking about how you move the ball forward, corralling some inside, but also outside. Because that's what I spent my career doing. And I see Joshua nodding. And can I give you a preview? Yes. We now use the term Overton window for the last couple years, but for a long time, I had used the term, and it's a Malcolm Gladwell term, about the tipping point. How do we hasten the tipping point? And now that I see Josh, I have notes on what I want to say in my outline, but Joshua, thank you. This is very helpful. I will now go back and do what I want to do. I do want to make one comment, though, or question. The public sector does not always have good ideas, but I find there a lot of times people who don't work in government have this arrogance about why doesn't the public sector just? And if only it was the same from the private sector. And you talked about some of the silly ideas, but even on the processes, yeah. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if you want to say anything or not about that.
Yeah, that's what I run up against all the time. I start the book with a story of someone calling me and saying like, "Hey, I'm stuck in traffic. Like, why don't you guys do something about this?" And and I think, I mean, so yeah, there. I didn't really talk that much about it, but certainly there was and still is some arrogance among the technology companies thinking that they can solve these problems, and if they would just be allowed to do their thing, everything would be fine. But the flip side of that is there is some arrogance among public sector folks who think, oh, we tried that and that doesn't work. Oh, you don't know, what the private sector doesn't understand how things work here. And so part of the role of anybody who's trying to make change is to bring those two sides together and figure out how can we actually work together on something that we agree is a common goal. If you can diminish the arrogance of both sides, you have a shot, right?
Thank you. A question that I had for you is, how do you secure the gains? Like, for example, like the bike share, I think there's a contract coming up again, and whether or not, say, Lyft, which has maybe different goals than a more public-centric low-cost program. Have you gone into the preservation game as well? And if so, what are some of the lessons learned there?
Preservation meaning
like you presented a lot of interesting ideas like bus lasers or bike share.
Yeah.
How do you keep those sustained?
Oh yeah, you're saying like they could easily fall apart,
right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think the ideally what you want to do is build support within the agency that's so strong and robust that it lasts beyond whenever you're going to be there, and it lasts beyond whatever challenges you might face. I think that did happen with the bus lane enforcement, right? Bus lane enforcement is expanding in Los Angeles because of the groundwork that we laid. And that the reason that that's been successful, first of all, I mean, it's a no-brainer program, right? It brings in money and it makes buses move faster. But even that aside, there was, once we built the support internally for this idea, there were a lot of people who kind of got behind it. And those people are still there, or the people they work for are still there. So, bike share is, one of the reasons that bike share has faced the obstacles it's faced is that it has not had that consistent support of, this is something LA Metro should do, and this is something that really matters. It wasn't even supposed to be Metro's project to begin with. They took it over when no one else wanted to do it. They charged prices that were, obviously way too high when they first started. Like, there were a lot of things that, and it was built fragmented instead of centralized out. I mean, there were many things that were done incorrectly, and that's why I think it's still struggled to sustain itself.
Joshua, I have the bonus, Sam Speroni, PhD student, the bonus of having been here when you did the informal version of this, when you were starting to write. We were in the conference room up in public affairs. So I'm curious, I recognize a lot of the points on the sort of master bullet list that you had. As you've done more with other agencies outside of Metro, how have the bullet points changed, or because of the realities of writing a book, are there bullet points that you would now change or maybe de-emphasize or emphasize based on what you've seen at other agencies, particularly if they're like different size, different geography, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, size definitely matters in this case, right? I mean, if you're talking about, like we're working now with some very small agencies, and in very small agencies, if you have a strong leader, you can have change that occurs rather rapidly, is what I've seen. But if you're talking about large transit agencies, I would say generally what we found in working with those agencies over the last 4 years is that they all face various versions of the same issue. It really depends entirely on leadership and governance as far as how well they're able to overcome those issues. So if you've got, like, Phil was a very strong leader who was emphasizing change and pushing it like crazy, and he was relatively successful in doing that compared to someone who's, like, let's say, a lifetime person at an agency who rises to the top as CEO, they're less likely to be able to push for those types of changes. But there are always, we see there are always some people within every agency who are trying to do something different, whether it's the CEO or somebody else, who are trying to do something different. And I think these lessons almost always apply, because anytime you're trying to do something different within a public agency, you cannot do it on your own. You cannot possibly do it without building coalitions, and you can't do it if you're completely pragmatic or if you're completely naive. You have to have that balance of both. So I see this stuff in every agency to varying degrees, but the places that have stronger governance structures or stronger leadership are going to be much more successful overall.
Thank you, Joshua. That's our time for today. Please join me in thanking Joshua Schank. Right. And so I hope you enjoyed today. If you did, we will be continuing this series. Gotta find the Zoom. Make it so folks at home or work can see. Good. We are continuing this series in the spring. So in the fall, we looked at LA's transportation past. Today was the present, which includes the recent past. And now we're moving to the future. So next quarter, we have a slate of speakers, and we may be announcing more set up. Just a little slow in duplicating. So April 29th, we have Jason Foster with Destination Crenshaw, who's going to be talking about Destination Crenshaw as a model for community-led infrastructure in other places. In May 13th, we have Professor Eric Guerra from University of Pennsylvania talking about his book, Overbuilt, the High Costs and Low Rewards of U.S. Highway Construction, of which we have a lot in Los Angeles. And maybe some implications there. As teased earlier today, Jody Litvak, senior fellow at UCLA ITS, will be talking about making change happen on May 6th. And then USC professor Genevieve Giuliano from their urban planning department will be talking about the long life of urban form, how the past may define the future of LA transit. So you can join these by looking at its.ucla.edu/events. They're going to be on our YouTube channel as well if you're joining from home or work or on the go or just mobily. Yeah. People are welcome to join in person if you're part of the campus community. We're moving back into the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, room 2343, next quarter. And if you are wondering more about us, you can find us at these links. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you again next quarter.